In this video, we'll talk about program evaluation. As a reminder, looking at the steps in program planning, when you're planning a program, you also want to build in your plan how you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of your program. And so in this stepwise diagram from your book about program planning, the last step is to think about the plan you're going to put together for evaluating program elements and effectiveness. Again, evaluation happens throughout and after your program's being implemented. However, you want to build in your evaluation plan before you even begin your program. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Talk about what are those elements you would build into your program planning outline, and then thinking about how you might actually use those tools to measure the effectiveness of a program. So a couple of questions for you to consider. What does it mean to evaluate a program? Secondly, what is the purpose or benefit of conducting a program evaluation? I already mentioned one of thinking about whether or not what your program, the program you develop, whether or not it's effective. And we'll talk more about thinking about ways you evaluate a program in the subsequent slides. From your book, it talks about reasons why you might conduct evaluation. So this first one really is thinking about you may want to have, you should have some kind of evaluation throughout carrying out your program to make sure that everything is working well and to see if you need to make any adjustments. So if there are things that aren't working well with maybe logistics of how it's being carried out, then you can make some adjustments that will help to improve subsequent implementations of your program. Next one is thinking about you maybe can conduct an evaluation. You may also be conducting it to show justification for your program, show accountability. So I mentioned with the grant writing, I mentioned that often you have to have accountability to your funding agency. So you may need to write a quarter report indicating what accomplishments you've made within that quarter towards the program so they can see that you're using their money effectively. So that's kind of what they're talking about here, justifying the budget or expenditures. I have to show accountability for the time that people are spending on the project to see that they're making progress towards the implementation of your program. The last one is probably the one you think of maybe most commonly or firstly is just showing that your program is effective. So looking at whether or not you've met your goals and objectives, and whether or not you have, you're documenting some of those outcomes and you're seeing some positive changes or in behavior or attitudes of your target audience that you're reaching towards what you want to accomplish for that program. There are different types of evaluation that you can do. And we're going to talk about 4 different sets of types of evaluation that you should consider when thinking about developing a program. So there's a formative evaluation, process evaluation, impact/outcome evaluation. I'm grouping those together. And the last one is fiscal or efficiency. So let's talk about each one. So what's a formative evaluation? Formative is an evaluation that is done before you actually implement your program. And it's a way to test your materials before you actually even implement it. I think this can be especially effective for things that you're using with technology to make sure that if you're using some kind of links on a website or a database that nothing's broken linked, or that the things aren't functioning correctly. You can test that beforehand and make sure that you take care of all of that before you actually roll out the real program. It can be a real benefit too if you're doing even the traditional in the classroom education, actually going through and practicing a lesson in a pilot sample can be beneficial to understand kind of where things get confusing or it doesn't seem natural, one transition to another, or what activity is not working. You can get feedback from the target audience to see what things they think should be changed to make it more effective for them to want to engage in the behavior you're trying to teach. So developers, if you can get the feedback from, of course, the team that's developing the materials, but it's always important to get feedback from people outside of the team as well. And just the second bullet point here, just thinking you can test whether the system's working as you intended it to. And like I said, are the developed materials relevant to the target population? So what is a process evaluation? Process evaluation really is thinking about looking back at your goals and objectives, looking at your process objectives. So it's related to how are you going to measure whether or not you accomplish those process objectives. Questions you might ask here: did your program get implemented in the manner you intended? Are you reaching the audience you'd intended? If not, what things happened to prevent it from happening as intended? A process evaluation is so critical in an evaluation, because sometimes you may not show a program, maybe people's behavior doesn't change in the way you wanted it to based on what you set in your outcome objectives, or maybe their attitudes don't change, again, how you wanted them to according to the outcome objectives. But maybe it wasn't because your program wasn't a good idea. Maybe it's because people didn't show up to your program or didn't access your program, or the people who were creating the materials didn't do it in a way that's relevant to the target audience, or maybe they didn't present it. If they're doing an education class in person, maybe they didn't present it in the way it was intended. So what a process evaluation does is it really helps you to understand if your program was carried out in the way that you had intended, so that you can be sure that if it was carried out the way you intended it to be, and there really was no effect shown, you didn't reach your outcome objectives, well, then maybe the program wasn't an effective program. Maybe you need to go back to the drawing board and figure out what you need to change in order to make it so that it reaches the target audience the way that you intended, that is changing the target audience's behavior and attitudes the way you intended. So speaking of the impact outcome evaluation, what is this about? Well, you want to know, how did the program affect the client? So this relates back to looking at our goals and objectives, relates back to the outcome objectives. Were they met? And you'll have to build in your evaluation plan, how are you going to measure whether or not your outcome objectives were met? What is a fiscal or efficiency evaluation? Well, this is two forms. You can have a cost effectiveness analysis or cost benefit analysis. What's on the screen here is a cost benefit analysis. So essentially what you're looking at is you're looking at all the costs of your program compared to benefits, which in this case is any kind of revenue that you might get from a program being implemented. Maybe there's healthcare savings that you can estimate or that you can document related to, if you implement this program, this is how much healthcare cost savings you get. So this obviously takes some skill to be able to account for this. And in my experience, when I've written a grant or I wanted to do some kind of a fiscal efficiency evaluation, I've actually collaborated with someone in economics, because this is really their area of expertise. If you're working in a community setting, you may want to partner with a university if you don't have expertise in the financial side of things and you don't have that expertise within your staffing. Cost effectiveness analysis, how this is done is you essentially look at the cost of implementing your program and you compare it to an estimated cost of a program you're comparing it to. So in the case of the Utah County WIC online classes, you could look at what is the cost of implementing these online classes versus doing the cost related to offering education live. So is it really saving WIC money by having these online classes? And so you can think about the time it takes for individuals to develop new curriculum, to teach the classes, all of that, and then think about what's the cost of that versus what's the cost of having these online classes. That could be a cost effectiveness analysis. So this is the Utah County WIC case study, and what I'm showing you on the left are the outcome and process objectives, and then on the right is the evaluation plan that we put together. So, and what we actually end up implementing as well. So for formative evaluation, we wanted to make sure that the technology was working the way we intended. So we plan to have others outside of the developmental team test it. So in this case, of course, the IT staff who were developing the database that housed all the online classes tested the functionality. We also need the WIC director and staff to test it, because from the WIC side, this database will allow WIC staff and director to be able to go into the system and verify which clients had actually completed the classes so that they could get recertified for WIC benefits. We also wanted the WIC clients to actually give feedback on the functionality of how the online classes worked. So the IT team really led the formative evaluation and getting that feedback so that we'd know that when we would roll it out to thousands of individuals, potential individuals or clients in the WIC program within Utah County, that we wouldn't run into as many issues with the functionality that we would have tested it before. The impact outcome evaluation, this really related back to our outcome objectives. So the first one was that women would have a 0.5 point increase in the Likert scale in their knowledge, behavioral intentions related to what was being presented in the classes. So how we measured that is just pre-post survey results. So looking at items, we would ask them questions before they took the class about their knowledge and behavioral intentions related to the content in the class. And then we'd ask the same survey at the end, and we could do a pre-post comparison to see whether or not on average there was an increase in their knowledge and behavioral intentions. The second one was looking at whether or not there was women perceived a benefit of taking online classes. And this was just series of questions on the post survey to see whether or not they felt that there was a benefit, and we would look at the results from that. The process objectives, thinking about what those were and how are we going to measure whether or not we met them. Well, for the first one here, it was just whether or not we wanted to create 10 classes. So the process evaluation would just be monitoring whether or not those number of courses were completed and approved by the WIC director. The second objective is related to hiring a computer science IT student, and then the graphic designer designing pages, the web pages for at least 10 classes. So here we look at the number, the type of staff hired as an evaluation to see if that occurred, and the number of classes were completed, that all the web pages were ready and designed in the time frame that we put. The 1.3 was looking at development of pre-post surveys. So here we just look at the number of Qualtrics surveys developed, and excuse me, and we also looked at how they were implemented, tracking that as well. I will say one thing that ended up happening in real life with this is one of our survey links actually was broken. So even though we did testing before, there was still an error there, and we lost some data from that particular course. We caught it, but it was after we didn't catch it as soon as we probably should have, and that was an error on our part of not following through with that process evaluation as well as we should have to make sure that everything was functioning well. And then for the second process objective, this was creating and implementing online survey to be able to answer this outcome objective. So really simply, the monitoring of this would be the number of surveys completed to see that we were actually reaching the target that we wanted to. So hopefully you can see that really thinking through the evaluation doesn't have to be super complicated. It depends on the program you're developing as to how you might evaluate the effectiveness of whether or not you've reached your outcome or process objectives. But it's really important to think about this beforehand so that you're not scrambling during your program to figure out how are we going to measure whether or not we met these objectives. It's better to think through them beforehand. And hopefully you have the funds to be able to carry through with an evaluation. Sometimes what will happen is that in their community sites is they may have funding and time frame to do the program, but they may not have a lot of time and resources to do a full evaluation of the program, which is unfortunate because that really is what determines whether or not what you've just implemented really is something to continue investing in. However, having just said that, I will say that I think there's definitely a trend now of funding agencies really wanting to see those outcomes, not just here's a great idea and we're going to fund it, but we want to see that it's effective, that we want to maybe expand it out to a broader audience or figure out why it's not working and tweak it to make it better, to create a next round of a program that maybe would be effective. So, like I said, though, what you end up doing for your evaluation may really depend on the time frame you have and the resources. At minimum, you should be doing a process evaluation because you really should be seeing whether or not your activities are being carried out the way you intended. But without this outcome or impact outcome evaluation, you really can't say much about your program as to whether or not it should be continued because it's effective or not. You just don't know if you can't measure those things. So if at all possible, you really want to make sure you're building in time and some resources for evaluation plan. Another concept in evaluation is what's called a SWOT analysis. This really is just another way of thinking about looking for factors that may be influencing your program success. So you want to look at weaknesses and strengths that are internal to your program, your organization, your agency. And then you want to look at opportunities and threats to your program that are outside of your agency or your program. So there are lists here of different types of items that could fit in each of these boxes. And each of these can either help enhance your program, or it may enhance your program, or it may detract from your program's success. So these just help you to kind of keep track of different things, again, that helps you further assess what you're seeing from your evaluation of your program. Another concept in evaluation is what's called a logic model. So a logic model can be really useful to give you a snapshot of the overall program and what you're intending to have happen, and also incorporating ideas from the SWOT analysis into a snapshot picture. There are some funding agencies, when you write a grant, who are going to require you to put in a logic model, because this gives them, again, a snapshot really of your whole program and what it's going to take to implement your program, and also to think about what types of things you're trying to accomplish. Therefore, what types of things are you going to need to evaluate in order to see whether or not you accomplish those items. So let's just start over here at the situation. So this is really looking at your program and what are some of the needs of your program, what are some of the assets you have of your program. So if you think this really could be related to the SWOT analysis, thinking about internally what are assets or strengths and what are needs, or thinking about maybe you've got some weaknesses as well. Inputs are, what is it going to take to be able to carry out your program? So what are all the resources, the financial and the human resources, time, all of that, what's it going to take in order to carry out your program? So what are the activities? These are really related to your process objectives. So what is going to be happening within your program? These activities lead to outputs. Outputs meaning, what are some tangible things that you're going to have as a result of implementing your program? And then here we have our outcomes. So think of these, they've broken it down in logic model in kind of 3 categories. So initial outcomes, intermediate outcomes, long-term outcomes. Think about all 3 of these collectively being your outcome objectives. And sometimes you can split your outcome objectives into different time frames. So initial outcomes might be immediately after your implementation of your program. What kinds of results do you want to have? What kind of outcomes do you want to have? Maybe you've got something 3 months after your program, then that's kind of an intermediate outcome. And for the behavior or the attitude, whatever you're measuring your outcome, you want that to last long term, like a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. In reality, a lot of programs only have funding for initial outcomes, maybe intermediate outcomes, but it's not as common to measure long-term outcomes. It's not that it never happens. It's just you have to have funding to be able to carry it out at a longer-term setting in order to see whether or not you have reached something more long-term. So like I said, when you're developing a program, you're also developing your evaluation plan and putting together logic model. So you can kind of decide then what kinds of outcomes you are going to write, and outcome objectives, that you're going to write, and whether or not you're going to be able to measure the effectiveness of all of those. Maybe your evaluation plan is only going to have the funds, resources to be able to look at initial outcomes, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you can't write some intermediate and long-term outcomes, but you may not be measuring those. And you might argue that if you're not going to be measuring these longer-term or intermediate, maybe in your logic model, you modify the logic model and you just put in some initial outcomes, and then you hope that relates to your goal. So the last thing is these influential factors. This really relates back to the SWOT analysis as well. This is looking at those external factors outside of your agency that may be opportunities or threats for your program succeeding. So let me show you an example of a logic model from the Utah County WIC program to maybe make it a little more concrete. So let's start with the situation. So the situation is thinking about, in this case, was the need to develop evidence-based online classes requiring nutrition, IT, and graphic design expertise. It would be ideal to offer in English and Spanish given the clientele in Utah County WIC program, but we didn't have funds to hire a professional Spanish translator. So that was definitely a challenge that we had within developing this program. Our inputs, we needed a grant. We had an internal grant from BYU called MEG Grant. We needed faculty, the WIC director, nutrition IT students, graphic designer, database software, computers. So we needed a Qualtrics survey tool, paper, statistical software, time. So those are all of the inputs that went into thinking about what we needed to implement this program. What were our activities? Well, hopefully you realize that these or see these, that these are related to, these are our process objectives that we saw earlier. So those are our activities. And those activities, we would lead to these outputs. So database to house classes, we'd have actual online classes, and we'd have surveys. So in this case, I did split out the outcome objectives into separate initial outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and then a long-term outcome. So our initial outcome you'll recognize as that first outcome objective to increase the 0.5 increase based on Likert scale knowledge and behavioral intentions. Intermediate is a little bit later than immediately after the class. So this was surveyed a little bit later as a post-survey. So 70% of survey will report a perceived benefit of taking online classes. And then a long-term outcome that we did not measure in this study, but was something that would be nice to have been able to measure, is to positively change at least 70% of WIC women's behavior to reflect nutrition recommendation given women and their children in the next 5 years. Our grant wasn't that long, so we did not measure this. And then this leads to our goal to determine the impact of online nutrition education program. And hopefully this looks familiar as well. This was the original goal that was written. And then finally, we've got this influential factors. And here I actually just went ahead and, even though this described some of those internal strengths and weaknesses, I went ahead and put it over here as well. So looking at the SWOT analysis, so our strengths internally were our staffing. We had expertise from different areas. We had WIC expertise in the project was critical. We had funding. We also had office location to do pilot testing that was free. And then we also, BYU has Qualtrics software. We have it generously free as faculty for research. So that was also free. So we had some great strengths within internally. What were some of the weaknesses? Well, all of us, even though we had expertise, we also had other priorities in our jobs. So this program was not our only task. So we had competing job priorities. We didn't have a professional Spanish translator on the team, which would limit our scope of implementing online classes. And also we had limited funds to be able to implement the project. So our funds were a $20,000 grant, which was very helpful in implementing the project, but it was limited as well of what we could actually do. Thinking externally, what are some of the opportunities or threats that we thought would potentially affect the success of our program? Opportunities were that technology was definitely becoming, we had some stats from the region that WIC clients were much more using technology and smartphones. So using online education would be an opportunity. The opportunity would be that people are more likely to have access to that online, to be able to access online classes. So that actually was an opportunity out in the environment of changing what had changed in the world to be able to make it so that was more mainstreamed and easy. It's also an opportunity that's easy to reach our target audience because they're all housed within a specific program that they need to do education anyway by federal law to get their benefits. And so we're already tapping into an audience that's readily there needing to do education. So we can get interest that way. What were some threats? outside of our agency that would maybe threaten the success of our program? Well, we do have, there are competing other online WIC classes from other states. So at the same time, the state WIC agency also for Utah had the Texas online education classes available for clients to take. So whether or not clients would choose ours over those was really up to them. We tried to make it so that we tailored it to the needs of the clients based on some needs assessment that was done. The clients in Utah County that was specific to that, but definitely that was a threat that they would potentially choose a different class than ours. And then also, because we're in Utah County and the high clientele is BYU and UVU students, there is a possibility that clients would have taken college nutrition courses. So maybe our education wouldn't provide as much of a benefit towards their knowledge and behavioral intentions and behavior as would taking a nutrition class. So maybe maybe the timing of them taking that would have interfered with their knowledge of the courses. And so just something to consider. One thing I didn't mention on the last slide is thinking about this influential factors really can influence the activities going to outputs. It can influence the outputs going to meeting your outcome objectives. So this is why this can be really helpful to think about, because this may help to explain why your program, if your program didn't show effectiveness based on what you're measuring for outcome objectives, then maybe it's because some of these competing factors that influence the being able to carry out your program or the success of your program. So that's all for this particular section. If you do have further questions on conducting an evaluation, just let me know.